Lane, do you think that it is fair to say that when Van Til says the that must precede uh, the how, or that our defense must presuppose who God is, do you think it's fair to say that already implied in this discussion is a question of method, of how we know who God is? That is, by way of his self revelation, certainly through nature, but especially given the fall through scripture. It seems to me that Van Til places such a premium on knowing who God is at the outset of his discussion that we can't adequately address that question without self consciously articulating a revealed and reformed conception of God over against the wild panoply of idols that the human heart is prone to construct when not self consciously submitting to the scriptures of God. In other words, the kind of God we have in mind needs to be self consciously distinguished from, say, Friedrich Schleiermacher's living God, who is the whence, as he puts it, of our religious experience, or Karl Barth's um, uh, event notion of God beyond all human apprehension, or Wolfhart Pannenberg's power of the future, or Gordon Kaufman, who taught at Harvard Divinity School, said the word God is just a human construct by which we order the world. All of these things, and we could go even maybe to be a little more controversial into the ancient period and say Aristotle's unmoved mover. Um, all of these things are non-Christian substitutes of who God is. So am I rushing ahead, or is it fair to say the methodology question's already at least implied here?
Well, Van Til is explicit later in this book that the starting point, the method, and the conclusion are interdependent and mutually contextualizing at every point. And here, relatively speaking, he's not yet discussing method and he's not yet discussing conclusion. This is starting point. And that starting point is the God not of rational reflection, not the God of community experience, but this is the God who, in his self contained sovereign triune identity, reveals himself in the works of creation, in an act of voluntary condescension we call covenant, and makes himself known to the creature and is himself, as Van Til's going to say, our interpretive concept everywhere. He says that in Common Grace in the Gospel, but that's here. So, Carlton, I think you're very insightful to bring that up at this point, remembering that the starting point, the method, and the conclusion are always mutually contextualizing features in a Reformed theology and apologetic. But because we can't say everything at once, and because we can't yet get to method and conclusion, I think you're very wise to remind us here that when we have this starting point, we have such a starting point, the triune, self contained God, immutable and impassible in his relation to the creature, because of our method. We are
Mhm.
beginning with God because we meet him in his self revelation. And as Bavinck and the Reformed tradition have made explicit, we have no knowledge of God at all apart from his self revelation, his self disclosure to us as creatures. And so, yes, I think that's really important because it keeps us from grounding theology in some kind of rational function of man or some communal interpretation of experience that is in one way or another isolated from or not dependent on the outset on the revelation of God. So yes, I think that's a wonderful point to make.